Hello, this is another one of my video summaries of Alistair Parker's book, The Second World War. This one dealing with the start of chapter 9 on economies at war. In this particular video I'm mostly going to be presenting basic statistics drawn from Parker's book. I'll then follow it with a series of videos on individual economies and also on inflation in general. Parker's main point is that the victorious Allies had between them larger populations and industrial output than the losing Axis powers. By my calculation from the figures he's given, of the core countries involved in population, the Allies had twice as many people as the Axis, 2.148 if you want a more exact figure, and in steel output, the Allies had almost 3 times as much as the Axis. So these are the initial population figures for 1939. You'll notice that the Allied total is in excess of 411 million, the Axis total less than 192 million. I'm not going to read out all of the figures. You can buy Parker's book if you want to look at those. But notice that when the war began in 1939, and the major countries involved were Britain, France, and Germany, then the German population is massively more than either the British or French populations individually, and even together they're not that many more than the German population. And Italy, of course, very quickly joined with Germany as an Axis power. Later on, you have the German invasion of the Soviet Union and Japan's invasion of European colonies in Southeast Asia, and the attack on American holdings in Pearl Harbor and elsewhere, as well as on the Philippines. And with that, you have the introduction of 2 major population centers, the Soviet Union and the States, and also, of course, Japan, but Japan is significantly smaller than those other 2. Then in terms of steel output, which of course is a very key indicator of industrial development, the Allied total is getting on for 90 million tons of steel in the 1930s, whilst the Axis total is over 31 million. And in terms of individual countries, do see the enormous predominance of the American steel production, 51 million tons. So in addition to the populations of the core countries, both the British and the French had large empires which could provide them with additional resources. In both cases, the majority populations were poorly educated and often illiterate, ill-nourished, and unhealthy, but they were both able to provide the imperial powers with additional troops, notably from French North Africa and British India. And of course, as Britain participated in the war from beginning to end, the Indian contribution was particularly significant. The resources of the British Empire, with a population over 500 million, were far greater than those of the French, with just over 100 million. A major role was played by the inhabitants of the 4 self-governing British dominions, that's Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, although in that case only the white population was actively involved, and the franchise was not general. All those 4 countries had well-educated people who were physically and mentally capable of providing high-quality recruits. All 4 followed Britain in declaring war against Germany in 1939. Canada and Australia also had significant industries. Canada was an industrially advanced nation with engineering plants capable of mass production. And it's often forgotten, but the Canadians manufactured 4% of the combat aircraft, 7% of the tanks, and 32% of the motor vehicles used by British Empire forces. They also fielded an army corps for the invasion of Normandy in 1944. So the Canadian and Australian, New Zealand, South African contributions were considerable. In terms of populations and steel production, I'm not going to go into these in detail, but you can see the massive population of India, the relatively small populations of Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, and then the significant amount of steel produced in Canada, Australia, and India, although of course not in the same league as the major powers. India deserves a special mention. The British Indian Army was very large and included many men with the intelligence and physique to serve as infantry, but less easily in technical and specialized arms of service or as effective NCOs and officers. Myself, I'm not sure whether that's really true or simply a matter of British prejudices at the time, but you can argue about that. Whilst many educated middle class Indians disliked Britain's World War II enemies, they were also reluctant to fight for a discriminatory imperial regime. As was noted, India also had a massive population and produced a significant amount of steel. World War II was a war of mass armies. Governments had to balance the demand for men to serve in their militaries and the need for labour in farming and an expanded industry. These are the maximum mobilized strengths, with the United States and the Soviet Union as the two largest, Germany coming in at number 3, and then smaller numbers for the other major suppliers of men. Notice also that in the Soviet and German cases, you've got additional men who served before becoming casualties. In modern warfare, education is an important factor in terms of the quality of troops that countries can raise. Education also facilitates industrial production. And there were major differences between the major nations involved in World War II in terms of their education systems. For the United States in 1940, in the 25-44 year age group, 15% had some higher education, and of the 14 to 16-year-olds, about 70% were at school. So these are very high figures for the time. In Britain, by contrast, only about 15% stayed at school beyond the age of 14, and compared to the United States, 10 times fewer enjoyed any form of education after the age of 18. So the British population were less educated than the Americans. In terms of Japan, the Soviet Union, and Germany, in the Japanese case, then 8% of Japanese males in the 25 to 44 age group had undergone higher education, which is a high figure for the time. In the Soviet Union, only a minority were well educated, but backwardness, which was still dominant, was in retreat. And so during the interwar period, the new Soviet regime instituted major programs of literacy training, and by 1926 over half the population was still illiterate, but it was a massive increase on what had gone before. By 1959, after the end of the war, illiteracy was down to 1.6%. In the case of Germany, there was educational decline in the late 30s, but the Nazi regime inherited a long tradition of high educational standards, and a far greater proportion of German boys went to secondary schools than in Britain or France, although that was no longer true by 1940. Infant mortality rates are a key indicator of any country's general development level. It represents the deaths within their first year of life amongst each 1,000 babies born alive. So, for example, here we have the Americans at the head of the list, with only 53 babies dying out of every 1,000 within the first year of life. It's a sensitive measure of comparative standards of health, education, administrative efficiency, and technical competence. These figures represent the average infant mortality rate over the 5 years preceding the war. So notice that even though the American figure is comparatively very low, there is a major divide between the white and non-white populations, with the non-whites having infant mortality rate of 83 in that period. Britain almost as good, with mortality rate of just over 58. Germany with 66, France with 71, then Italy with 103 almost. But notice again that, like in America, Italy was a very divided country, with southern towns having an infant mortality rate almost twice those of central Italy. Japan, 110, British India, almost 156. Turning to the production of war materiel, including basic supply materials such as trucks and merchant ships, then we have the following data for the number of aircraft, tanks and self-propelled guns, artillery trucks, merchant ships, surface warships, and submarines. So aircraft production, which Parker regards as the best single measure of industrial achievement in the war, these are the actual number of aircraft produced. And the figures in terms of aircraft weight are more desperate. These are not given here, as British and American factories produced a much higher proportion of heavy bombers than the Germans. Notice that in 1944, the Americans produced 3 times the weight of the combined output of aircraft of Germany and Japan. The statistics that Parker gives are much more detailed than the ones I'm giving here. He gives figures for intermediate years, which I'm leaving out. And one of the things that he notes is that in 1941, the Italian production figures peaked at 3,503 aircraft. Of the major other countries, then the main thing to notice perhaps is that in 1939, before the Americans were involved in the war, they're producing only 5,856 aircraft. But by 1944, they're producing over 96,000, so an enormous increase, and far higher by that time of any other country. The Soviet Union, by 1944, is up to over 40,000 aircraft, so again a very large number, and before the war they're 10,000. The UK, again, you've got a jump from almost 8,000 at the start of the war to 26,000 by 1944. Germany, again, an enormous leap from 8,000 to 39,000, and Japan from 4,000 to 28,000. Tanks and self-propelled guns. These are essential for modern large-scale land operations, along with artillery and trucks. The American and Soviet designers produced successful medium tanks, the Sherman and the T-34, but only the Soviets produced heavy tanks which could successfully confront the German Marks 5 and 6, that's the Panther and the Tiger. The British also manufactured large numbers of armored personnel carriers. Neither the Italians nor the Japanese made many tanks, only about 3,500 each during the war, and neither's tanks were equal to the medium tanks of the major producers. These are the actual figures, which I'm not going to read. So you've got 4 major tank making countries: Britain, the United States, Soviet Union, and Germany. Notice in the British case that the production goes down from 1943, a peak year to 1944 from 7,000 to 4,600. The States, by contrast, that before its involvement in the war was only producing 331, I guess just tanks, not self-propelled guns at that point, but by 1943 goes up to 42,000 plus, and then the Soviet Union up to 24,000 by that date, and Germany reaches its peak towards the end of the war in 1944. In terms of artillery of 75mm caliber and above, in the 1940 to 44 period as a whole, then again you can see major differences between the various powers, with the Soviet Union as the major producer, followed by the United States, and then Germany, and then Britain, and then Japan, and finally Italy in very much 6th place. In terms of trucks, which we don't normally think of as a major element in warfare perhaps, but of course they provide a massive element of logistical support. The strength of the American motor industry ensured superior mobility for all of the Allied armies. American trucks were unparalleled for their sturdiness and reliability, and in addition, the Americans also produced almost 1 million light trucks, mostly Jeeps, which of course are still familiar in the world today. These are production figures. Again, I'm not going to go into them in any detail. Notice that Britain goes down from 1943 to 44, with a peak of 88,000. The Americans, meanwhile, go up to a peak of 628, or 629,000. The Soviet Union by that time 45,000 in 43, and the Germans almost 82,000. Japan lagging behind with 11,500, and even less in 1944. Merchant ships, like trucks, are very vital to the conduct of a modern war. Warfare across the oceans needed both cargo ships and warships to protect them, or to sink enemy cargo carriers. As with much else, American shipbuilding expanded on a, quote, war-winning scale. And after 1941, Canadian shipyards also produced another 2,250,000 tons of merchant ships, significant contribution. In terms of gross tonnage, Parker only gives us figures for Britain, the United States, and Japan. Notice that in 1940, Britain was still the largest ship producer, with 810,000 tons. Japan is also significant at that time, but the United States isn't. But after the United States joined the war, then the Americans massively contributed to the number of ships in the world, merchant ships, and by 1944 they were producing over 12 million, compared to the British figure of 1 million, which is not that much higher than the figure in 1940, and Japan at the same time was 1.7 million. Parker also provides additional figures for other years, but that will do for this presentation. In terms of surface warships built during the war, and remember that whilst Britain and Germany were at war from 1939 through to 1945, Italy only joined the war in 1940 and was knocked out in 1943, and the Americans and Japanese were involved from 1941 to 45, so we've got different year categories there. Anyway, in terms of battleships and battle cruisers, 22 of these major ships were produced. The Allies, a total of 15, Americans and British, mostly the Americans. Then the Axis, you have 7 with Italy actually being the largest producer. In terms of fleet aircraft carriers, 30 of these were produced. Most of these were produced by the Allies, again, United States, 3 times as many as the British, and then also 3 times as many as the Japanese, and Germany and Italy not included at all here. And then light aircraft carriers, a much larger number, 136. Again, mostly the Allies, particularly the United States, with 116 light aircraft carriers, and Japan and Britain, a smaller number. For cruisers, again, mostly the Allies, with 89 cruisers total, and 77 produced by the Allies, and the rest by Japan, Germany, and Italy. And then destroyers, same story, with 614 destroyers produced overall, the majority of them by the Allies. By contrast, the Axis predominated in the production of submarines. At the outbreak of the war, Germany had 57 submarines, Italy 115, Japan 63, total for 235, and during the war they built another 1,240, mostly produced by Germany. By contrast, Britain and America had 168 at the outbreak of the war, and during the war they built only another 355, with both the British and the Americans major producers in comparative terms. So that's what I'm going to say for the moment. I hope I haven't lost you in a fog of statistics. Do look at Parker's book if you want to follow those statistics in more detail. Thank you very much for listening, and particular thanks to my patrons, without whom I wouldn't be able to make these videos. You're very welcome to support my channel if you will. Please do like, comment and share on the videos. It really does help. Subscribe if you want to be notified of future videos. I'll give Patreon and PayPal links below. And next week we'll talk about Germany in terms of its wartime economy. Have a good day.